South African President Cyril Ramaphosa will tomorrow share his plan for the year with the nation. The president had a busy time last year as chairperson of the African Union during a global health pandemic. To help us make sense of the president's tenure and his performance on the continental and global stages, we'll be in conversation this evening by analyst Liesl from the Institute of Security Studies and our East African correspondent Sarah Gemani and our US correspondent Showen Bryce will be joining us for that conversation. Also, a bit later on, what is this Zumbani green tea that some Zimbabweans are raving about to treat COVID-19 symptoms? Good evening, I'm Aldrin Simpier, and this is African Perspective. Well, as promised, the conversation that we said that we're having this evening, we will be joined, as I've indicated earlier on, by Liesl, who's joining us via Skype. Good evening and welcome to the show, Liesl.
Good evening, Alden. Thank you.
Thank you so much for making time for us. Let's start off with you. What's your take of the president's assessment of his tenure as the African Union chairperson?
Look, I think President Cyril Ramaphosa did well when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic. He really had a very inclusive approach. Many structures of the African Union that was almost dormant, one could say, he revived. There were many meetings. He had special envoys. There were good cooperation, I think, on the level of the African Union between countries when it came to procurement, platforms, PPE. You must remember that when the outbreak came in February, March last year, there were many countries that hardly had any equipment to deal with this pandemic. So I think in that, when it came to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, many people in Addis Ababa and AU officials and so on have said they are actually very grateful it was President Cyril Ramaphosa that was chairing the AU at such a critical time. So I think he really stepped up to the plate. There where I think one could say it was a missed opportunity was when it came to the theme of 2020, which was silencing the guns. And of course, COVID-19 did derail many of the efforts, but I think there were some things that we could have done, some low-hanging fruit, even just a statement questioning some of the elections we had last year that were really not free and fair, some presidents who were twisting their constitutions to stay on for a third term and so on. And also, particularly for us in Southern Africa, at the level of the African Union, every time you try and speak about Zimbabwe or Mozambique, people say, oh, no, it's SADC. Now, we had an opportunity. You only get to chair the AU once in every 15 years or so. We had an opportunity, I think, to put issues of our region on the continental agenda, and that really didn't happen.
Yeah, and speaking about that, Liesl, before I go over to Sarah, is that in his State of the Nation address as well, the president spoke about using the African peer review mechanism to promote democracy, but that didn't really come across strongly. I know even in his acceptance speech as African Union chairperson, that was something that was mentioned as well.
Exactly. Now, we are still chairing the African peer review mechanism for another 2 years, I think. So there is still that opportunity. But ordinary people on the continent were actually looking at South Africa to give some guidance to, as I say, even just a statement saying, there are questions around the elections in Uganda and the opposition in places like Cote d'Ivoire. We had elections in Burundi and Tanzania last year that really were questionable. And South Africa really didn't say anything about those elections and about the very, very real governance challenges we have on the continent.
Okay, and Sarah, you were there in Addis Ababa as the president made his acceptance speech. What are some of the highlights, looking retrospectively at what he mentioned in the speech and saying that at least perhaps he was able to hit these notes?
Well, when he took over, I remember we didn't even manage to interview him because the electoral process took quite long. But a lot of people looked to South Africa as a guarantor of the peace agreement in South Sudan, as the ones at the front line in trying to get peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Burundi, and in many parts of the Southern African region, that they would actually own the theme of this year, which was silencing the guns. However, some will argue that COVID-19 has actually taken over much of the agenda that the president may have had. However, there's some areas where a lot of people will say the African Union, and in this case now led by President Ramaphosa, was definitely quiet. For example, in this region, the conflict that is still unraveling in the seat of the African Union in Ethiopia, that has a lot of people wondering, where is the African Union? In fact, you don't need to go very far. You just need to look at the social media. Everybody asking, where is the African Union? How come President Ramaphosa is not able to stand up to his peer, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed? South Sudan, the process has been slow. There have been talks of forming a hybrid court, but not so much has been seen. And South Africa is the guarantor to that agreement. Looking at the Southern African region, the same thing. But probably one that shocked a lot of people is that now we are seeing, instead of coups, what we are seeing is that a lot of African countries are changing the constitution so that presidents continue to stay in power. And we saw a lot of that happening. There was not a mention from the African Union, whether led by the president or even the AUC Commission. So a lot of people feeling that he may have failed. However, where we must give credit to the president and South Africa is that since the outbreak of the first case of COVID-19 in Africa, we have seen President Ramaphosa all the time holding meetings, getting the regional leaders together and trying to get solutions. And he has spoken out a lot at the G20 summit, at the World Economic Forum most recently, but even just trying to get the Africa CDC's presence felt and putting Africa CDC at the center of how the continent responds to COVID-19. That, I must say, a lot of people have appreciated, and the continent has appreciated the leadership of President Ramaphosa.
When you speak about, Sarah, when you speak about Ethiopia, are you speaking about the conflict in Tigray, or are you also speaking then about the conflict over the Grand Renaissance Dam?
Well, the Grand Renaissance Dam, we must give it to the African Union, led by President Ramaphosa. They were able to take back the negotiations and say that the African Union will lead that. And so that has been appreciated by African countries, including countries like Kenya that have been following that as interested parties. But when you speak about the conflict itself, the Tigray region, the Oromo, and the very fear that there could be a civil war breaking out in Ethiopia, that worries the region a lot. And there's also the missed election just 2 days ago in Somalia, just some of the things that this region would have wanted to see more leadership from the African Union, and they feel that the African Union may have dragged its feet in seeking solutions. Probably because it's not easy when you have to gather, every time you have to gather leaders virtually. They could argue that maybe sometimes has delayed solutions. But there are those who will feel that it's even easier when you have, you can gather people quickly and talk to them and warn them and, or even release a statement to say we are concerned. Yeah.
And Sherwin Briceby is also joining us for this conversation. Good evening, Sherwin. Welcome to the show. Speaking about the Grand Renaissance Dam, there was an attempt, at least from LCC, to have this matter being discussed at the UN Security Council.
Well, it was touched on at the United Nations Security Council, Aldrin, but the UN, as it does, often defers to sub-regional organizations like the African Union. And so when we spoke to the Secretary General about this very issue, Antonio Guterres, he expressed confidence in the leadership of the AU chairman, the former AU chairman, President Cyril Ramaphosa. But in addition to that, I just want to touch on some of the issues that Sarah and Liesl have touched on, and correctly so, that the president does deserve credit for the agility and the dexterity in which they were able to reassert themselves in the virtual space because of COVID-19. Sarah correctly points out that he was very prominent, whether you're talking about UN meetings, AU meetings, EU meetings, meetings that were happening all around the world. A fatigued Cyril Ramaphosa always showed up. And I reached out to some of my interlocutors within the international relations space, and my understanding is that the president, Aldrin, is going to touch on some of the successes that they believe they achieved during their term as AU chairman, leading the AU in an unexpected COVID pandemic, curtailing travel and those interpersonal relationships that Sarah pointed out. You know, the SG has told me personally, Aldrin, that they miss those meetings because they believe that those face-to-face interactions are key to achieving some of the political goals in the geopolitical space. He's going to talk about the establishment of an AU COVID-19 response fund, the African vaccine acquisition task team that is being identified as securing those 1 billion vaccine doses that where the timeline certainly for distribution in Africa seems a bit uncertain, appointment of special envoys to fight COVID, the establishment of the African Medical Supplies Program, efforts to engage international financial institutions on the question of debt relief for developing countries during this pandemic. I have a clip of the president speaking to this at the UN General Assembly debate in September last year. Let's watch.
It is in the spirit of this new global deal that we call on the international community and our international partners to support the rollout of a comprehensive stimulus package for African countries. This will enable African countries to not only mitigate the health impacts of COVID-19, but to aid us in the immense task of rebuilding our shattered economies. To ensure that no country is left behind, we reiterate our position as the African Union that economic sanctions against Zimbabwe and Sudan should be lifted to allow their governments to respond adequately to the pandemic. We also call for the suspension of interest payments on Africa's external and public debt. As the African Union, we are encouraged by the collaboration of the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN towards finding solutions to debt sustainability in developing countries. This pandemic has highlighted the urgency with which we must strive to meet all the sustainable development goals. But more importantly, goal 1, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere.
And Aldrin, the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative has suspended debt service payments for developing countries up to June of 2021. We understand that this is something the president is very proud of. Also, the adoption of a declaration on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which forms the basis of intra-trade, the intra-trade agreement, which is effective from January 1st this year. But then, of course, the adoption of the declaration on the silencing of the guns that has now been extended to a new deadline of 2030. They are now touting this as a success, but as Sarah and Liesl have pointed out, this should also be seen as a failure in terms of not meeting the aspirations of silencing the guns. We saw today that in Mali, for example, 20 UN peacekeepers have been injured by an attack on the UN peacekeeping base there. The process in South Sudan has been developing very slowly. Libya, one of the low-hanging fruit. We've seen some political progress there, but not where we need to be with elections looming in the very near future there. So a very mixed bag, certainly, in terms of silencing the guns, which was the theme, certainly, of their chairmanship.
And what happened in 2020, Liesl, is that we also saw an escalation of the conflict in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. And as you said earlier on, that it's almost like there's a kick for touch. Keep on shifting the blame, or let's speak about this and say that, sure, it is a SADC problem. It's SADC that should be dealing with this issue.
Yes, that is a very, very, urgent issue that has to be addressed by SADC. And we had hope that because there were this hesitancy and the dynamics that we know in terms of SADC, that the African Union would at least convene the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. But I have to say, President Cyril Ramaphosa traveled to Botswana and to Maputo at the end of last year and the beginning of this year for SADC summits, which, you know, we didn't have a real outcome. In fact, it was then the decision about what SADC would do in terms of intervention was postponed until the 17th of January, another summit of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security, which was then again postponed. So I don't think we can, as such, fault President Ramaphosa because, as I said, he actually traveled to those summits of SADC. It is very complex, but very urgent. The UN has said there are over 500,000 internally displaced. We now have 2,500 civilians that have been killed in very, very brutal circumstances in northern Mozambique. And, you know, the Total, the oil and gas companies are saying that they have shifted their personnel off the Afungi Peninsula there in Mozambique, where some of the violence is now coming so close to these very, very important gas installations in Mozambique. So I think for South Africa, it is a huge problem because South Africa can't be seen to act bilaterally in Mozambique. It has to be within the within SADC multilaterally or within the African Union. And as I said, that really just didn't happen last year. And this year, you know, we're no longer chairing the AU. So it's not up to us to put things on the agenda. Hopefully, SADC, you know, will start coming up with some solutions for the crisis.
Just quickly, Liesl, do you think that President Filipe should, I don't know, carry some of the blame as well because of how he downplayed the situation?
Yes, and I think we've even discussed this on your platform before, Aldrin. It is true that Mozambique has called upon now assistance and training and so on from the European Union and others, and also private security companies and so on. So when it comes to the SADC response, it is true that there is a sense President Filipe Nyusi, who is chairing SADC actually, that is the irony of it, is almost blocking. And we can really compare it to the way Nigeria for many years blocked any discussions about Boko Haram in the region and at the level of the African Union until the neighbors actually put pressure on Nigeria and said, listen, this crisis is spilling over the borders. We need to address it as a collective. That hasn't happened when it, you know, in terms of this crisis in Mozambique.
Sherwin, just quickly then, from the UN Security Council side and the embargo, for instance, that was imposed on the sale of arms to Libya, and how that embargo has not been adhered to by certain countries. Do you think that South Africa was strong enough in trying to push for some sort of sanctions against these countries or some sort of repercussions for these countries that have gone against the embargo?
It's a great question because it really speaks to the ineffectiveness, despite heavy lifting done by the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, that they have limited impact. South Africa entered this 2-year non-permanent term with a great deal of enthusiasm. They were infusing the memory and the ideals and the ideology of Nelson Mandela. They were really going in guns blazing, excuse the pun, and really came up against the geopolitical obstacles that are the bigger nations, the veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council. And it's the very big nations that have those vetoes that are themselves the main perpetrators of violating those arms embargoes and other regional powers in the Middle East region in terms of violating that arms embargo, which South Africa has been very critical of, echoing sentiments expressed by various UN officials, including the UN Security Council, but having limited effect. I asked former South African Ambassador Jerry Machila about this very point, and he said that these are, the main perpetrators here are the very powerful countries in the Council that certainly don't listen to the smaller voices despite the unanimity that you find on these issues by the 10 members that are non-permanent, the ones that serve only 2-year terms. So South Africa has met roadblocks not only on Libya, they've met roadblocks in terms of progress as it relates to the Middle East process. Of course, the Palestinian question is a big issue for the South African government. Nelson Mandela, of course, famously talking about the fact that there will only be, peace in South Africa is related to peace in Palestine. Various roadblocks in terms of Western Sahara. France still wielding a great deal of power on that Security Council file. So, despite the heavy lifting, despite the right words and rhetoric in the Council, South Africa encountering various roadblocks that speak to the broader need for the reform in the UN Security Council, which, as you know, has been a 2 decades process that is moving very, very slowly in terms of those intergovernmental negotiations now.
Okay, and Sarah, as we conclude the retrospective review of former President, well, not former President, but President Cyril Ramaphosa, former chairperson rather, of the African Union. Something that constantly comes up, Sarah, is the reform of the United Nations Security Council. This is a constant. However, though, it almost seems to be a constant stumbling block as well. Why is that?
Well, probably because of the influence that we have. Anytime you see countries meeting at the African Union Summit, there's always a divide between the various blocs. You'll find the Anglophone countries on one side, the Francophone on the other, or you find ECOWAS on one side, the ESC countries on the other. And this always rears its ugly head and makes it very difficult for the continent to speak with one voice. However, we saw President Ramaphosa try to insist on that a lot of, and we saw it again with COVID, where the countries were bargaining as one. We saw the amount of influence they had with COVAX, and that shows that it's possible. But one of the other things that we must give credit to the chairman, the past chairman now, is what he did with the African Continental Free Trade Area. During his time, he was able to push from behind the scenes more countries to ratify, but he was also very vocal on the issue of infrastructure, insisting that unless countries in the region improve their infrastructure, even if all the countries finally ratify and the process takes effect, unless there is proper infrastructure, then it becomes impossible for the continent to trade with each other. And he insisted on this even on the last day during the summit in Addis Ababa. I'm not sure if you still have that clip, but that is one of the issues that will go down in history. And the fact that the African Union even set up a fund now that will be able to marshal funds that can be put together so that countries on the continent then can do regional infrastructure projects. Take, for example, if it is the train, it moves from Mombasa in Kenya and docks all the way in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or if it's the seaports, they ensure that they are interconnected. And he says this will be able to enhance trade so that we move from the 15% that we have been talking to amongst ourselves to, he was saying, something close to 53% by 2030.
The report we have with regards to the picky continent-wide country projects is quite impressive and is as follows. The Kinshasa-Brazzaville Bridge, Road and Rail Project, led by the Republic of Congo and the DRC, there has been excellent progress with unlocking the necessary funding in this regard. This was one of the key successes at the Africa Investment Forum that was held in Sandton in Johannesburg, South Africa, in November 2019. And in talking about this, I do indeed want to pause and applaud the initiative that President Adesina, the President of the Africa Development Bank, has come up with, that we should each year hold an Africa Investment Forum where the bank has been able to mobilize not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars in investment in infrastructure on our own continent. And this is a great success and needs to be applauded.
Well, that is... Okay, Sarah, you can go ahead. You can quickly wrap that up.
So there you have it, Aldrin. As I was saying, you see, a lot of countries in the region will have faith in a country that is moneyed, so to speak, leading the process of trading together, and the process of the continent coming together to trade as one bloc. And so we will still be watching if the country, South Africa, will have an influence, considering the Secretary General of the platform is still South African. And so it will be interesting to see if more countries will ratify, if indeed what is still the sticking points will be sorted out within this year, and the continent can finally begin to feel the effects of one continent trading together, a market of 1 billion people, not a small market at all.
Yeah. And Sarah, we were expecting the African Free Trade Area to be launched last year. I think it was last year, mid-year. However, though that didn't happen, but now it is in place. So what are some of the most crucial issues as we start off with the African Free Trade Area?
Well, one of the things that countries will have to do, and maybe they'll go back to their regional blocks first, is to deal with issues of non-tariff barriers, to deal with issues of origin of products, because some of these countries are still exporting products from outside, and especially from China, and then bringing them into their countries and now trying to sell them into the other African countries. So there will be need to finish the drafts on areas of origin and all that. Before then, we can begin to say that we are trading, but there are countries that have still not ratified that the African Union insists are key in ensuring that trade within ourselves and amongst ourselves is successful.
Okay. Liesl, what do you think we should be expecting from the President tomorrow when he delivers the State of the Nation address? Also considering that last year's State of the Nation address almost mentioned global politics or continental politics as a sidebar. Hi, Liesl, are you still there?
Are you asking me? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, of course. Yes, foreign policy hasn't always, had a very big part of the SONA speech, but I think there are a few issues that one can expect around COVID-19, the sort of vaccine nationalism that we're seeing around the world. And as Sarah has mentioned, President Ramaphosa has really been quite strong on this in various platforms, Davos, etc. So I think maybe, he will continue to say and join the campaign actually for having more democratic distribution of vaccines and the countries not hoarding vaccines, etc. I also think, we do have a new president in the US, and that is a hopeful, I think, in terms of the relations between South Africa and the US and then the continent itself. So I think those issues, I don't think we can expect that the tricky, sensitive governance questions, even Mozambique might be mentioned just in passing. Those are some of the crises we have in the region, to grapple with. Mm-hmm. But I think, obviously the AFCFTA that Sarah was talking about, and Wamkele Mene, who is the Secretary General, is at the Secretariat in Ghana. He's doing a great job from what we can see. And actually, South Africa, Nigeria, the big industrialized economies of the continent are by far the ones that are going to benefit the most from the AFCFTA because we are exporting to the rest of the continent. Yeah. So that could be part of the speech that, when it comes to economic opportunities for South Africa on the continent. Mm.
And Sharon, for you, some of your expectations?
Yeah, let's not discount the fact that the president might be watching African Perspective, Alvin, so he might be taking a few notes from what we are saying in terms of what he needs to include in that speech. And he might very well touch on the centrality of multilateralism. Liesl correctly points out that we have a new sheriff in town in the United States, and that bodes well for the U.S. re-engagement with multilateral institutions, including the United Nations. You saw a very positive posture from the President Biden a few days ago, just ahead of that AU summit, where he talked about this new relationship. The US standing ready, he said, now to be your partner in solidarity and support and mutual respect, and certainly signals from Washington, Aldrin, that the US wants to build a strong partnership with Africa, reinvigorating relationships built on mutual respect. And that, I think, is a very broad departure from the S-hole countries that that certainly the former president of the United States spoke about.
Should we have included a beep there?
Say that again?
Should we have included a bleep there?
I bleeped it for you. I bleeped it for you.
Thank you so much for that. We've come to the end of that conversation. Indeed, the president will be delivering the State of the Nation address tomorrow, and his speech will be at 7 o'clock. It will be live here on the SABC News channel as well.